Curi watched the dancing lights on the station's floor with some mild interest, using them as a nice little distraction as they got lost in thought. They were certainly much nicer to look at than the faces of those that were surrounding them. They were used to the looks, of course, but that didn't mean that they enjoyed seeing them. It was much nicer to just watch as the little lights sparkled and danced around their legs as they scuttled along the walkways, just going anywhere without a plan like they hadn't done since they couldn't remember anymore. However, unlike back whenever that might have been, they weren't alone today, and their somewhat reluctant company seemingly had a problem with long silences. "It sure is pretty," Kenta said in a half mumble, clearly not quite having it in her to really speak up, as she slowly scuttled along a step and a half behind Curi. Her long, smooth fur was moving in large ways with each long step the Raphaelite took, and it seemed that she had taken notice of Curi's distracted fascination with the little plays of light that had accompanied them ever since they came to this station. "Though I can't help but wonder if the prettiness is worth all the maintenance that must come along with something like this. I cannot help but imagine the amount of times those little lamps must burn out, or otherwise get damaged in the long run." Curi stopped for a moment, which caused the play of lights to twirl around the tips of their 6 legs in little spirals, gently reflecting on the matte surface of their metal. "It must take a lot of work," they concurred, as they watched on while the small chains of dotted lights playfully danced around them. Right now, they were all perfect and pristine, but even just a few of them breaking would be enough to break most of the illusion. Just a few dark spots in the chain of lights, and the smooth perception of motion would give way to the reality of small lamps simply lighting up in succession with each other. Illusions were so easy to break sometimes, but somehow, it was only ever the pretty ones. "You know," Kenta then spoke up again, interrupting Curi's thoughts. Her voice was a lot more confident than before, and it actually sounded like she had something to say this time. "It is interesting getting to know one of my mother's new friends a bit more personally, especially considering everything that has happened. I promise it is not meant in an offensive way when I say this, but after knowing her my entire life, and a large part of hers, I can't say I would have ever imagined my mother keeping company such as yourself. I must admit, it was quite the whiplash to find out how much she seems to have changed in such a short amount of time." Curi paused for a moment, and began to draw a shape along the floor with the tip of one of their legs, quietly observing as the dancing lights began to follow after it, while they delved into memories for a moment. Memories of a time when things had started to change a lot for them as well. "When I first met her, Moore was still a very different person," the cyborg admitted, after they had thought back to that time. Back when James had pulled them out of their burning laboratory and started to actively seek their company after, often bringing others along with him, or bringing Curi along to those others, even though they were far less enthusiastic about the process of being around an augmented being. Of course, around that time, it hadn't been quite so publicly known yet that James was also enhanced, even if much less visibly so than Curi was. Back then, Shida had been the most vocal of her dislike of artificial additions to one's body, very openly proclaiming her literal disgust for the very concept. However, in contrast to that, interacting with the feline, while often irritating due to her rather rough and deliberately abrasive behaviours at the time, had overall been easy for the most part. According to herself, Shida had apparently never perceived Curi as augmented, since their current form was the only one she had ever known them as, and it simply looked like a robot to her, which severely lessened her active disgust. But with Moore, things had been different. "I think it took a long time before she started to like me." Curi finally continued their thoughts in a confession. "She had that look in her eyes for a long time, that look that told me she was just being polite when she didn't actively chastise my existence. I could tell that she was uncomfortable around me, even if she didn't say it outright. I could tell that she was suppressing it to pull away any time I touched her, and it was like that for quite a while." The eye that Kenta had turned in Curi's direction widened slightly, but her face also turned a bit confused. Curi could imagine what she was thinking. She probably wasn't sure why her mother would go through the trouble of hiding her uneasiness for a person such as Curi was. Most likely because the old Raphaelite presumably hadn't done so in the past. After all, Curi very well remembered the way Moore had often behaved towards Shida back then, which was very openly and directly hostile in many cases. Of course, the specific reason for the behaviour was different, but Curi couldn't quite imagine that meant that the old lady's behaviour towards people like Curi had greatly differed from her behaviour towards dangerous predators, especially of the Deathworld kind. But that was, of course, before she had met a certain someone. But I greatly respect her for taking the time to get to know me despite all that. Curi therefore finished their statement, once Kenta seemed to be attentively listening to them, after getting over her first bit of surprise. During one of their first meetings, James had managed to seriously shake her in some of her preconceptions. It was lucky on his part. It probably wouldn't have hit her quite as hard had his identity, or more precisely that of his species, not been deliberately kept a secret from the rest of our crew back then. That way, she had been inadvertently forced to engage with James as a person first, before she learned of the label that the galaxy had put on him, which probably made it a good bit harder for her to disregard his words once she ultimately found out about it. Still, not everyone would have used such an event to take a closer look at themselves and to take the time to try and see past one's own horizon. It cannot have been easy for her to do it, and therefore I greatly respect her for it, even if it took her a while to truly change the way she previously thought. By now, I value her company and friendship incredibly, and I could not be happier that she decided to take the first step to approach me, despite her uneasiness around me. Kenta's eye widened a bit more, and although she seemed to be quite happy to hear someone speak so highly of her mother, she also appeared to be slightly flustered by Curi's explanations, even if the cyborg couldn't quite figure out why that would be. "That is very adult," Kenta said a bit under her breath, and began to make long combing motions with her claws through the long fur of her neck. "Thank you," Curi replied, although admittedly they weren't quite sure if they had even been the addressee of the compliment or not. Still, they decided to just take it anyway. For a moment, they looked up and away from the lights on the ground, mostly to orient themselves and figure out where exactly their legs had taken them while they were aimlessly wandering. To their surprise and slight chagrin, their eyes soon fell onto a stage-like display that had been pulled up in the middle of the way, showing a blood-smeared flag of the human territories that was plastered with the pictures of those who had been killed and injured in the recent attack on the local detention center. A mocking monument to the lives that had been lost, as well as to the people who had been at least allegedly responsible for it. It really was a shameful display, even if it presumably came from a place of justified anger. Curi just wished that the people who had orchestrated it would have used their energy more productively instead. At least it seemed nobody was bothering to camp out in front of the memorial today. Although their attack was far from out of everyone's mind, even now, it was quite apparent that the people no longer felt the need to form loud, eye-catching crowds in front of the reminder on the daily, now that the galaxy's media attention had once again turned elsewhere, since the last conferences that had taken place on the station had come to an end. Even the very target of their ire had simply left these angry people behind. And although some humans remained who were still investigating the incident professionally, apparently those were far less fun to antagonize than the previous political visitors were. Inadvertently, something drew Curi towards the display of pictures, and before they knew it, they had slowly walked up to the wall full of portraits and looked up at the faces, many of whom now only existed as a glimpse into the past, as the lights behind their eyes had been extinguished. There were familiar visages among them, of course. Galorable and those who had accompanied him, for example. According to testimonies and investigations, they had been the very target of the attack and got executed on the spot. However, many of the other faces were not the ones that Curi had ever been aware of seeing. And presumably, they had all simply gotten unlucky and were caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. They simply got caught in someone else's trouble. and for unfair reasons that likely no one could explain, they had paid with their lives for it. As Curi looked to the faces of young Lakshaset, Pixameria, and all manner of other species, all smiling at the camera, and clearly ready to happily face life's challenges, only to never get the chance because they got caught up in a fight that wasn't their own, their hearts turned heavy for a moment. The attempt on their own life had been more, in a way, subtle, of course. As subtle as an explosion could be, at least. It had targeted them very specifically. And afterwards, as others had started to stay close and watch out for them, that has seemingly been enough to deter any more attacks of the same kind ever since. Of course, that didn't mean Curi had never been in danger again, but the vehicle of said danger had been very different ever since that assassination attempt. However, for a moment they wondered, what if? What if that hadn't been enough to deter the attacks? What if they had simply kept trying? And what if someone else had been around the next time they did? The attempt on Curi's life had mostly been thwarted by the fact that their attacker had seriously misjudged the cyborg's physical durability when planning for the explosion, leaving Curi mostly unscathed while their lab was basically destroyed. However, that didn't mean that the attack hadn't still been very deadly, at least for most anyone who wasn't Curi. Had a similar attack taken place while they were in the company of someone not as heavily augmented as they themselves were, even someone as presumably hardy as a human or Miat, their friends would also have ended up as a picture on a wall. "Are you all right?" A voice pulled the cyborg out of their thoughts, slowly causing their consciousness to return to awareness, now once again seeing the pictures that had mesmerized them so thoroughly in front of them. The printed, lifeless eyes of a Pixameria was stiffly staring back at them, the camera catching their light glow as the primate beamed at the lens. Only after a moment did Curi realize that they were standing uncomfortably close in front of the print, causing them to quickly take a step back. They shifted their body slightly, looking around for Kenta, whose voice had pulled them back into reality. It seemed that the woman had gotten a bit worried about them, judging by her tone, presumably after the cyborg had started to stare at the picture more and more intensely. "Yes, I am all right," Curi quickly assured her, now that they had become aware of their surroundings again. "I was just thinking and imagining something uncomfortable." Kenta scratched through the fur on her neck even more intensely than before, as she looked down at the cyborg, her gaze also momentarily shifting over to the pictures on the blood-stained wall. "Maybe we should go somewhere else," she suggested after a moment, and Curi could see her swallowing heavily at the presence that the display exuded. Curi felt like she was probably right, as they really didn't want to imagine any more horrible things that may have happened, and instead they simply wanted to be glad that they didn't happen. However, before they could make any motion to agree with Kenta's assessment, they were cut off by a sudden ripping noise that was soon followed by the clattering of metal on hollow ground, as well as annoyed curses that a hissing voice pressed out under its breath. In surprise, Curi and Kenta both jolted around so their gazes could follow the sound to its source. They had been too focused to notice it, but not far from them, someone else had also climbed up onto the stage and walked up to the wall of pictures, although said person seemingly had a very different purpose with their actions than the cyborg and their companion. Curi tried to reconstruct what had probably happened as best as they could, based on what they saw before them. Not far away, the shiny black form of an alonyxliah was standing hunched over, their upper body held close to the ground, while they used their single remaining arm to sweep together an array of strewn about cans of preserved food, most of which had rolled a good bit away from them after presumably causing the clattering sound, as they dropped to the floor earlier, which was also indicated by the still half-filled but also half-open bag that hung around the reptilian's empty shoulder and swayed precariously as the person tried to balance themselves on their free remaining legs as they tried to gather their lost items. They were still cursing under their breath as they reached their arm as far as they could, in order to reach a can that had rolled particularly far from them, and they seemed determined to avoid having to take another step to pick it up, as they stretched themselves out, using their thick tail as a counterweight. One arm and one leg, both on the same side of the body, had very obviously been surgically removed, leaving behind empty joints, and deep scarring that webbed along their scale-covered body like cracks along damaged glass, indicated that the damage may have been much further reaching than just the limbs themselves. Just next to them, one of the pictures that were hung up on the wall lay unceremoniously on the ground, and a large tear had ripped off one entire corner of the photograph. But the person on it was still clearly recognizable, and it was the very one that was currently doing their best to collect their scattered purchases in an agitated manner. Curi assumed the following had happened. The person had, for one reason or another, climbed up onto the stage, and proceeded to rip their own picture off the memorial. In the process, possibly due to not being quite used to their new situation as an amputee, and possibly for any other reason, they had accidentally moved in a way that had opened their bag and caused some of its contents to spill out, to their great annoyance, and now they were trying to remedy that mistake. Curi then noticed that one of the cans had rolled quite close to one of their legs, and thoroughly out of reach of the crawling person. Quickly sprouting some of the prehensile tubes out of the leg, Curi moved to pick the can up, and carefully carried it over to the alonyxliah in just a few steps, holding it out to them helpfully. "Here," they said, after there was no reaction at first, presumably since the person was too busy cursing to themselves, and being annoyed to really notice the attempt at help. However, they looked up at the sound, at first only seeing the can that was being held out to them. "Oh, thank you," they began to say as they reached for it. However, then, they presumably realized just what kind of appendage was holding the can, and they quickly pulled their hand back in shock before they could accidentally touch the mobile metal. Their gaze shot up with a tilt at their triangular head, and although their eyes were just as black as the scales covering their body, Curi was sure that they could see the shock in them as they flinched at the sight of the cyborg, and, keeping their head as low as it had been while they tried to pick up the cans, they slowly tried to pull away backwards, slightly inhibited by the fact that they had one less leg at their disposal than they were used to, which caused the movement to be awkward and hobbling, instead of quiet and smooth. Curi suppressed the urge to audibly sigh, despite their body having no physical need to sigh in any way, as they carefully set the can down onto the ground, before pulling the prehensile tubes back into their leg and placing it on the ground, taking a step away so their presence would no longer distress the lizard. "Sorry for startling you," they then quickly said, before immediately turning around to join back up with Kenta and take her suggestion of leaving before anything else could happen. However, before they had taken more than 3 steps away, it seemed that the person had broken through their first moment of shock. "I saw you on TV." The alonyxliah said their first full sentence that wasn't a curse, causing Curi to stop in their tracks. "You were with the humans, weren't you?" "Yes," Curi replied, after pausing a moment to steel themselves for the interaction. "But I do not wish to discuss anything about the attack, if that is your intention. I am sorry, but I have different worries at the moment." They turned their body enough so they could look back at the reptile. The black-scaled lizard had stood up in the meantime, now standing similarly high to Curi, and they tilted their head a bit to look at the wall full of pictures and then back at Curi. "Yeah," they said, and their tone was rather unreadable to the cyborg. Curi couldn't quite tell if it was scornful or actually understanding. "If I were you, I probably wouldn't want to talk about it either." After they said that, they hobbled a bit closer and leaned down to pick up the can that Curi had handed them earlier, depositing it into their bag. Curi looked at them for a moment. The urge to avoid an uncomfortable interaction was strong within them, and for a moment they almost started to walk away again. However, something else within them quickly won out before they even really noticed it coming up. "Why did you tear your photograph off the wall?" they asked, as their name-giving curiosity overcame them and brought the question out before conscious thought had the chance to get in the way. The lizard seemed surprised by that question. Most likely they had expected this to turn into a productive conversation of any kind, just as little as Curi did. and so the fact that they were simply asked an honest question took them out of the moment, and thus somehow compelled them to answer. "Oh, they said, and looked down at the ripped picture that was still laying on the ground. "Well, people I know, but don't know well apparently, kept calling my family because they thought I was dead when they saw my face among the people here. It was starting to really freak my mother out, so I decided to take care of it now that this place isn't constantly guarded anymore." Quickly, they then leaned down, swiped the paper off the floor with a swift movement of their remaining hand, and crumpling it up into a ball between their fingers, before finally tossing it into their bag, along with their cans of food as well. "I may have been banged up pretty badly, but I'm not dead yet," they mumbled aggressively, now more to themselves than to the cyborg, and their hand inadvertently wandered over to their empty shoulder, pressing against it flatly, as if searching for the arm that used to be situated there not too long ago. "I hope your family will no longer be harassed now," Curi said with honest sympathy, especially as they observed the quite familiar motion. Changing their tune to a careful one, they added, "Getting used to a life with some of your limbs missing is an exhausting process. I don't know if you are planning to get aids to make things easier on yourself, but if you are, and you are being held up by waiting times with the local professionals, it might be worth partaking in the services of a close-by medical tent. Some of my friends work there, and they have thorough knowledge when it comes to mobility and aids for those who have an affliction such as yours. They are currently in the process of packing up, but I am sure they will not turn you away if you ask for their help." The look in the alonyxliah's eyes shifted now. After they had been moved to honesty, after Curi had surprised them with their earnesty, it seemed this new topic was rousing their suspicion, as well as their ire. They pushed themselves up a bit higher, and moved their triangular head in a way that presented their flat forehead to Curi, as they opened their mouth to allow their forked blue tongue to flick out for a long moment. "Aids from your friends, huh?" they said, with very clear antipathy in their voice, especially as they glanced along Curi's metal body. It was quite clear what they thought Curi's offer entailed. "I think I'll very well pass on that." Curi shook their bodies slightly. Something within them wondered a bit why they even bothered. Why they even tried to help this person, who so very clearly had no high opinion of them, who, in fact, seemed quite antagonistic towards them. However, that part of them was surprisingly small, and they barely paid attention to it as they calmly replied, "While I would more than gladly help you out with any questions that you may have when it comes to cybernetic replacements for your lost limbs that would allow you to lead an entirely uninhibited life, I am very well aware that most people do not wish to take that option for themselves, or more precisely, most do not even see it as an option. The offer I am making consists entirely of traditional, non-invasive mobility aids, and my friends neither have expertise with cybernetics, nor do they offer them as part of their service. They will not even bring the topic up with you, so I highly encourage you to talk to them, no matter what you may think of me personally." Curi's interlocutor seemed to be strongly taken aback by the cyborg's calm and candid offer against their hostile call-out. It seemed like they were at a loss for words for some time, with their black eyes wide open and their stance slightly unsteady as they tried to rebalance themselves, despite their missing leg. Curi, now feeling satisfied with what they had said, gave them a quick small bow before turning again. "Farewell," they said, as they joined back up with Kenta, who had quietly observed the exchange. And although they knew they hadn't done much, after all, it was quite possible that the person wouldn't care at all about their well-meant advice, the cyborg admittedly felt good about themselves, and they enjoyed it, even if they didn't quite know why. Closer to the core of the galaxy, Shida was concentrated on listening to the sounds all around them, as she, together with James, Coco and Sam, was making a quick run down the block in order to procure some local beverages that some of the humans had begun to like the taste of. Generally, this wasn't the kind of job James would have personally gone on, and since this was very much a herbivore drink, Shida also wasn't getting anything out of this trip. However, since the local people had shown themselves to often be less than agreeable to their presence, reacting with open hostility far more often than any of them would have expected out of ancient core worlders of all people. It had been deemed the best course of action for Shida and James to generally stay away from people as much as possible, while others handled the tasks that their presence was not essential for. Meaning the two of them had been rather cooped up in their room ever since they had first arrived on Geralitan, at least whenever James wasn't invited to some sort of political outing. And those hadn't been extremely numerous so far. And after a certain while of simply sitting in a room in hostile territory, even if it was with someone whose company they thoroughly enjoyed, the Deathworlder's brain eventually needed some change of scenery, even if it was just for a quick walk down to the corner store. Together, they had determined that the risk was most likely minimal, as long as they all stuck close to each other, moved swiftly, and didn't engage with any unnecessary social contact. Still, they had to be on high alert because even if a Koiveri stepping out of line and actually attacking them wasn't especially dangerous in a physical sense, avoiding physical conflict and with it a possible diplomatic incident was still something that they put quite a lot of stock into. Which was exactly why Shida had her ears so wide open, constantly scanning their surroundings on the wide open street. The humans had the edge in eyesight, meaning her playing lookout would make little sense, as there was nothing that she would catch before the primates could. However, when it came to ears, hers were a peck above the rest, meaning she could maybe warn everyone of unseen dangers before they would appear. And out of all of them, Shida was especially motivated to avoid any conflict, because, admittedly, she wasn't really confident in how well she would be able to hold herself back, should it actually come to blows. She could feel her claws itching whenever the mere thought of throwing out a swat came up in her mind, and she felt like she should probably not give her natural weapons any unnecessary chance to act up, as long as they felt like they might abuse it. Some more recent words of her therapist distantly echoed in her mind, as she walked while sticking closely to James's back in their formation. You should try to find a productive outlet for this anger. A productive outlet? That was a nice thought and all, but she didn't quite know what productive thing there was to do with it, or being stuck in a damn hotel room in the middle of some core world. And that wasn't even mentioning the fact that she couldn't quite imagine anything productive coming out of it, because it wasn't just a general feeling of drive that she constantly felt, but a very directed anger that oh so very much did not want to be productive in any way. But maybe she just needed to think about this harder. Maybe she could... Her ears suddenly twitched, as her thoughts were interrupted by the hurrying sound of footsteps coming in the group's direction. Someone was running towards them. No, not just someone. A group of someones. 3 at least. And definitely Corverie. The sound of their split feet was unmistakable. Still, something about the sound was odd when compared to the large, armored people's usual footsteps that she had heard ever since she had come to this planet. These ones were faster, somehow. Lighter. And there was something else coming along with them. Something besides the footsteps that accompanied them in an uneven rhythm. Something that sounded like bouncing rubber? Before Shida even had the chance to call out the sound, the humans had already picked up on it themselves, and reacted as they formed a wall between James and the sounds that came towards them from the direction of the next corner. Shida quickly took her position as well, standing close to James with her shoulder touching his, as she stared at the place where their vision was still blocked by the corner of a building's wall, but where the forms of those running towards them would soon emerge, judging by their sound. However, the first thing that came around the corner was by no means a Koiveri. Instead, a round form bounced along the ground in an unpredictable manner. The sphere was bright blue like a Koiveri's eye, and its diameter was so large that the thing would reach up to one of the larger human's knees, if it would ever lay still. However, that appeared to be a tall order, since the thing seemed to have a mind of its own, as it bounced left to right without much rhyme or reason each time it hit the ground, instead of following the usual predictable laws of physics that one would expect out of a ball. The entire group stared at the bouncy sphere for a moment, as it unpredictably wobbled all over the place, eventually flying around the corner and vaguely in their direction, though it seemed like it would still miss them by a mile if it kept going as it was. Not too long after, 3 bodies came hurtling after the ball, barely managing to take the corner as they ran, and seemingly had to turn quite drastically to keep up with the ball that had quite suddenly changed its direction. As the three awkward beings skittered and stumbled around the corner, Shida also finally realised why the footsteps had sounded so strange. They were just a bunch of kids. While a usual full-grown corvée easily towered over a human, with sometimes more than twice their height, these three clumsy examples stood around the height of James, and they clearly didn't move with much regard for their surroundings, as they ran after the bouncing plaything. In an instant, Shida could see Coco's gaze twitch from the kids to the ball, and then to the nearby road, and immediately the commander made an executive decision. In a quick burst of speed, she peeled away from the formation, took a few skilled steps sideways, and swiftly fished the ball out of midair with a sweep of her highly raised foot, catching the large blue sphere and balancing it on the wide of her shoe. The corvée quickly stemmed their feet into the ground as they screeched to a halt, their blue eyes widening a bit as they unsurely stared at the strange being that had caught their toy there. They didn't seem to really know what to do with this situation. By now, the entire group around Shida had relaxed quite a bit, seen as the approaching steps were just a bunch of playing kids, and after only a moment, Coco seemed ready to relieve the children of their awkward situation, as she quickly kicked the ball over to James. Although it flew just as awkwardly, after being kicked as it did when just bouncing, James managed to catch the thing and balance it on his mechanical hand for a second, before then quickly throwing it back over to its rightful owners. "Careful with the road, alright kids?" he advised them earnestly, as he watched the largest of the three catch the ball with their long tendril-like arms. The kids glanced back and forth at each other, nervously rubbing the tips of their flexible arms along their bark-like armor, while letting out low, strumming vocalizations. Eventually, the one that had caught the ball simply blurted out, "Yes, sir. Thank you," before most of them quickly turned back in the direction they had come from, and hurried away. Although the smallest of them remained for a moment more, and stared at James intensely for a couple of seconds. "My mummy says she hates your guts," the kid then very helpfully informed James, as they pointed at him with one of their flexible arms. James inadvertently released an amused scoff. "I bet she does," he replied to the kid, and simply shrugged his shoulders. "You be careful now, alright?" "Alright," the kid answered with a nod, and waved free of their arms, as they then quickly hurried after their friends. "Bye." "Bye," James gave back and waved as well, before sighing deeply and crossing his arms. Kids are great. Not too far away from the scene, an annoyed sound was released through sharp teeth, as a previously aiming barrel was forcibly shoved aside by a frustrated hand. "First opportunity in days, and he's hiding behind fucking children," Espataris said, in very clear frustration. No matter how much he wanted to do this, and oh did he want to do this, he wasn't going to do it in front of children. "Think he's doing it on purpose?" Maraksha teasingly asked him from the side, a moment before a slightly quivering hand lowered onto his shoulder. Espataris snarled again and shook his head. "Of course not," he let out, still as pissed as before, but now holding his outburst back slightly, given the proximity to his injured friend. "But that doesn't mean I'm not mad." He then released a low breath, trying to calm himself down from this tantrum that even he could see was unnecessary. "But the time will come soon," he said, once he felt his emotions simmering down again. "Very soon." Miraksha gave him a worried look, but a smile was spreading across Espataris' face. They were so close now. What were a couple more days?